Valentino, Regulator and Policy Specialist. Been at RSSB now for 5 years. Joined RSSB from ORA, where I had a similar role, working in safety regulation. So yeah, my background's policy. And yeah, so I'm going to kick off this session. First of all, by giving you an overview of the legal framework around railway standards, and then I'll pass you over to Bridget, and she's going to talk to you about the application of standards to railway projects. So I'm going to cover UK legislation, non-RSSB standards that support compliance with legislation, and RSSB standards that support compliance with legislation. So when we talk about legislation, we are talking about acts of parliaments, which are primary legislation, and secondary legislation in the form of statutory instruments. Most common that you may come across are regulations, but you also have statutory instruments in the form of orders or rules. You may come across level crossing orders, they're statutory instruments. So an example of primary legislation is the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act 1974. So this sets out high-level goals and principles that the government wants businesses and people to comply with. An example here is Section 2 in the Health and Safety at Work Act, which requires every employer to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health, safety, and welfare at work of all its employees. So that's sort of a broad sort of requirement. And then often you get regulations that are made under the Act, which goes into a bit more detail. So for example, you've got the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999, and Regulation 3 of those regulations have requirements for the employer to make a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risks. Sorry about that. Of the risks to the health and safety of his employees to which they are exposed while they are at work. So the Health and Safety at Work Act have powers that allow ministers to make regulations under the Act. Under the Act, there are several pieces of secondary legislation. Often they focus on certain hazards, and these regulations, they apply to many, many different businesses, rail businesses, offices, if they're applicable to their sort of their operation. So these regulations are enforced by the Health and Safety Executive. The Health and Safety Executive is responsible for developing and proposing regulations to the Secretary of State for these regulations. There are also railway-specific legislation that are made under the Health and Safety at Work Act. ROGS is one of those. And the railway interoperability regulations, they're actually made under the Transport Act 2000. So the reason why there's a dotted line there is because they are, although they're not made under the Health and Safety at Work Act, they are enforced by ORR under that act. The Office of Rail and Road is responsible for developing and proposing safety regulations. So under ROGS, ORR proposes regulations to the Secretary of State. Under the interoperability regs, I think it's the department that would ultimately be responsible for proposing legislation to the secretary of state. So I'm going to focus just on those two regulations. So it's ROGS and RIR. So ROGS, those regulations contain requirements for safe operation. So the duty holder under those regulations will be required to have a safety management system. ROGS is supported by guidance. So there's guidance published which will provide further information on how to comply with the regulations. And then on the right, you've got the interoperability regulations. Those regulations contain requirements for new or modified equipment to be safely integrated into the existing system. Those regulations are also supported by guidance, which goes into a bit more detail about how you can comply with the regulations. So the non-RSSB standards that support those regulations, I'm just going to talk about those. The first one's going to be the National Technical Specification Notices. So these are a replication of the European equivalent called Technical Specifications for Interoperability, TSIs for short. So at the point of the UK leaving the transition period from exiting the European Union, these NTSNs were created and they replicated the TSIs on the 1st of January. So the TSIs cover various subsystems. So, so there's a TSI for safety in railway tunnels, there's one for control, command and signalling, one for operation, traffic and management, infrastructure, energy, locomotive and passenger, rolling stock, noise, freight wagon rolling stock, persons with reduced mobility, telematic applications for passenger and freight. So these 9, however many there are, 9, 11. So all of these NTSNs, they contain essential requirements under 6 headings. So you have safety, reliability and availability, health, environmental protection, technical compatibility, accessibility. So these NTSNs define the technical and operational standard that must be met in order to satisfy the essential requirements and ensure interoperability of the rail system. So then we have British, European and international standards. So these facilitate trade between countries and they're mandatory when referenced in the NTSNs. So the NTSNs sometimes reference British, European and international standards. And when they do, they are mandatory. NTSNs are mandatory under the interoperability regs. So it's mandatory to comply with those if they're applicable. The British, European and international standards, they are sometimes also referenced from RSSB standards. So that's railway group standards, rail industry standards. So whenever the British and European and international standards, whenever they are referenced from RSSB standards, it's mandatory to comply with those standards. Otherwise, it's voluntary. So common safety methods. There's a requirement under ROGS for operators to comply with common safety methods. So these originate from the EU, common safety methods, and at the point of the UK leaving the transition period. they were made UK law, and they were corrected by various EU exit statutory instruments to make them work within Great Britain. So there are 5 common safety methods, or CSMs. So you've got monitoring, which is supported by guidance. And you've got risk evaluation and assessment, that's also supported by guidance. So these 2 CSMs, they apply to duty holders. So the CSM for monitoring applies to railway undertakings and infrastructure managers and entities in charge of maintenance. The common safety method for risk evaluation and assessment applies for the 3 that I've just mentioned. It also applies to project entities. That could be a manufacturer or contracting entity, whenever they engage an assessment body. You've also got common safety methods for assessing conformity with the requirements for obtaining safety certificates and safety authorizations. And there's a common safety method for supervision by national safety authorities. So the 3 at the bottom, they apply to the safety authority, which in Great Britain is ORR. Now to talk about RSSB standards. So we have 4 types of standards. So we've got national operations publications. They contain direct instructions to staff, for example, drivers, signallers, shunters. And they're published by our RSSB on behalf of railway undertakings and infrastructure managers. So national technical specification notices contain the requirement for operators to have a rule book. There's also a link to ROGS. So then under ROGS, as part of the safety management system, the operator needs to comply with relevant standards. So this could be a relevant standard. So national RSSB publishes railway group standards, but railway group standards, they contain national technical rules. So under RIR, it's mandatory to comply with national technical rules, and they provide additional requirements to the NTSNs to ensure that the essential requirements are met. So compliance with national technical rules is through RIR, but there's also a requirement to comply with them as railway group standards through the operator license issued by ORR. So RSSB can only publish national technical rules under limited circumstances. So that's to fill an open point, to support UK specific cases, or to maintain technical compatibility with legacy assets that do not conform to the requirements of the NTSN. Then we have rail industry standards and guidance notes. So the production of these and the amendment of these are usually driven by a request from industry. Compliance with rail industry standards is through the operator licenses issued by ORR and as part of the safety management system. Guidance notes loosely could be linked from requirements in ROGS through the safety management system as well. The railway group standards and RISAs published by RSSB have a standard structure they contain requirements that set out what the user has to do to claim compliance with the standard. So there's a rationale which justifies the reason for the requirement and why the requirement is good. And then there's some guidance, which sort of gives you a bit more of an explanation of the requirement and how you can meet the requirement. So I'm going to talk to you about the processes for developing, amending all of these documents. But first, I'll just say a bit about standards committees, because RSSB's standards are developed and published through standards committees. So the standards committees, they are based on the different subsystems. So you've got rolling stock, infrastructure, energy, data systems and telematics, plant, traffic operation and management, and control, command and signaling. So what's the process for making or amending UK legislation? So that process starts off with an idea, and that idea is reviewed by the regulator. So that could be ORR, it could be the Health and Safety Executive. And then they would then forward that to the parent department. So Department for Transport, Department of Work and Pensions, in the case of Health and Safety Executive. So they will review the idea against government policy, and then there'll be a decision to proceed. Then there's a process of drafting and a consensus on the draft before there's a consultation with industry. Following consultation, proposals may be revised, and then that then goes to Parliament for scrutiny. If it's an act of Parliament, it will then eventually gain royal assent once it's been through the parliamentary process. If it's a statutory instrument, then that is signed by the Secretary of State. So once those regulations are published and implemented, then some years later, 5 years is the standard time frame, when they get reviewed, and then following that review, you may start the cycle all over again. So common safety methods, there's not been any sort of process set out for amending those yet. They will be retained in the UK following the retained EU law bill that's going through Parliament. So any decisions on updating those will be taken by government on a case-by-case basis. British, European, international standards, they are developed by the European Standards Body or British Standard Institution, and we have industry reps that attend the drafting committees for these and provide input as an industry voice. National Technical Specification Notices. So these originally were based on the TSIs. We have a process for amending these. We're actually currently going through a process of amending the NTSN on the basis of the revision of the TSIs in the EU. So they follow a similar process to the legislation that I just went through. So it starts off with a need for change. So in the case of what we're doing at the moment, the need for change was the fact that the TSIs were changing. And then RSSB will then develop proposals and rationale. That's reviewed by government against wider government policy. And then RSSB drafts the business case for change. which sets out the objectives for the change and any sort of costs and benefits. That's then put to the standards committee, which will develop a recommendation. And then the industry standards coordinating committee will endorse if there are any divergence for the TSI, from the TSI. DFT will then agree an update on the NTSN, and then the standards committee reviews its fitness for industry before we consult. Following consultation, we will go through comments and may make amendments. And then finally, the recommendations put to the department, and then DFT will then go through a process of legal and economic scrutiny before it goes to Parliament if there are any divergences, and then signed off by the Secretary of State. Once published, they may then go through another cycle of review later on, but there's been no time limit set for when these are reviewed, but they're likely to still be reviewed alongside the TSIs. So RSSB standards follow a similar cycle as well. So that starts off with an idea. Request for help form on our website is usually the place where it starts. And then the idea from the request for help is then evaluated. Project is created that defines the scope of the project. Then there's a decision to proceed by the standards committee. RSSB will then start drafting the standard till a consensus is reached before consultation. And then following consultation, there's revision, or if there's a possibility of a revision. And then final approval and publication before it's implemented. And then after 1 year, the standard's reviewed. And if it's fit for purpose, it then won't be reviewed again for another 5 years. And then we start this cycle again. So how do all these fit together? Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that. Yeah, you can apply for a deviation from standards. Bridget will actually say, Bridget will say a bit more about that in her piece after this.
Which is interesting because it's very familiar but strangely different.
I think someone's got their mic on. So how do all these fit together? Is there a hierarchy for all this? Well, the question is no, not really. I mean, there's no official hierarchy of these standards. But if you think about the level of detail of these documents, then you could arrange them in this triangle where you have UKX sitting at the top, setting out high level requirements, and then you have the regulations below that go into a bit more detail. Then you've got NTSMs, CSMs, and national technical rules that go into even more detail. And then you've got RISs and NOPs, which may go into even more detail. And then you've got guidance at the bottom. So this is loosely you could fit these in. I mean, it's not a rigid structure, but you know, if you just wanted to think about the level of detail, this is probably how you could arrange them. So that's all I have to say. I'm going to pass you on to my colleague Bridget, who's going to talk to you about the application to railway projects. Over to you, Bridget.
Thank you, Steph. And I'm going to share my screen for a minute. There. Right, I am Bridget Eickhoff, Principal Infrastructure Engineer within RSSB. I'm a mechanical engineer. I am also a fellow of the PWI, and my career has been spent at the wheel rail vehicle track interface. So I've looked at the track from the vehicle side, the vehicle from the track side, and everything that happens in between. So what I'm going to do, building on what Steph has said, is think, how does this work for some possible projects? So let's go back a couple of spaces. Why do we want standards at all? Why is any of this actually relevant? And there's a number of really good reasons why we want standards: to manage interfaces. And one of the earliest standards, you could say, went back to Britain's Gauge Act of 1846, which then required standard gauge. And that was when the Great Western Railway had to adapt the broad gauge to standard gauge, and standard gauge has been standard since 1846. If we don't have standard track gauge and wheel spacing, the railway system really doesn't work at all. Compatibility. And as those who know me will know, I've spent the last few years working on platform train interface. Now that's an interesting area of compatibility. So platforms and train footsteps, we need standards to try and manage that difficult interface. It's cost effective. In the old cliche, there's no point reinventing the wheel. If somebody's got a good way of doing something, why wouldn't anybody else want to do it if it works for them? And to manage safety. So use of best practice, avoiding repeats of previous accidents, and avoiding known errors. So protecting us all by enabling us to do the safe thing. Now, I like this definition. This is the ISO definition of what is a standard. And there's two things that I want to pick out of that. The first word is consensus. And consensus is a very interesting word. In the standards context, it means the absence of sustained opposition. That's a dictionary definition. But what that means is it doesn't think that everybody thinks that this is the best possible solution. It means that nobody thinks it's impossible. So it's the absence of sustained opposition rather than everybody cheering. That's consensus. And the other bit I like in here is the optimum degree of order. A standard doesn't necessarily mean that everybody everywhere does exactly the same thing if it's not appropriate. So, but equally, complete anarchy is probably not appropriate in most cases either. So it's the optimum degree of order. So bear those two things in mind. Steph has done some of this already, but I'm going to put it slightly differently. So they're all standards, but they may be imposed by different means. So as Steph has very capably shown us, all sorts of people impose standards on us. Or it may be a recognised way of meeting a requirement. So industry good practice, or if you do it this way, you don't have to make any further justification. If you want to do it some other way, you've got to explain why that's good. We try to write standards which are performance or output based, but there are still quite a lot around which are actually prescriptive or input based that tell you what you need to do, not what you need to achieve. That will take time to fix. Some of them, the better ones, are based on science. So there is some real science behind the limits and the risks and the control measures, but there are still a fair number that are based on experience, how for things not to go wrong that have gone wrong before. Doesn't mean they're bad standards, but it makes them harder to vary. And another way of looking at responsibilities, a wide range of parties may be involved in a project. That's just some of them. That is by no means all of them. And duty holders, that's those people, the infrastructure manager, track infrastructure, the railway undertaking operator, and the infrastructure manager for the station, who may not be the same organisation as the infrastructure manager for the track, they have those specific responsibilities at the bottom to assess and manage the risks, to comply with the relevant standards, and to consult and collaborate with other parties at the interfaces. And that is a clear responsibility for duty holders. Right, Steph mentioned deviations. A deviation is what I like to think of as a locally specific standard. It's permission to manage the risk in a different way. It isn't permission to ignore the risk. It isn't permission to ignore the standard. It's permission to manage the risk in a different way. And that principle applies to all standards. Different processes apply to the different types of standards, and who needs to agree to the deviation or dispensation or some other D words depends on the standard. But in all cases, the application will need to explain why the standard is not appropriate for this particular application, what is proposed instead, why this is equivalent for managing the risk, and is it temporary or is it permanent? And it also needs support from all affected parties, particularly any control measures that the other party will need to take to manage the risk. So a project introducing a change can't say, oh, this risk is managed because so-and-so is doing something else if so-and-so doesn't agree. It has to be formal agreement from everybody who's involved in managing the risk. And the appropriate standards body, which for the Railway Group standards would be the Standards Committee, will consider, discuss, ask questions and approve or reject. Steph has gone through some of the processes for changing standards, but there's some very good reasons why they need to change over time. Technology moves on, we get better understanding, we find errors, there's lots of reasons why standards helpfully evolve. And these are some of the groups that are responsible for making those changes. So as many of you will know, the TSIs are currently have been reviewed by the European Railway Agency. The NTSNs are currently being reviewed here. The ENs are reviewed every 5 years by Senelec, which is the electrical one, and ETSI, or as appropriate. Railway Group standards are reviewed every 5 years if they've not been changed in between. But any errors or requests for change can be flagged up by anybody at any time. So if there's a concern, please flag it. And deviations are very useful indicators of areas of a standard that may need to change. If there's a lot of deviations in a particular area, the standard is probably not optimum. So let's take an example. This is platform, track and train. That's one of my areas, and it's one that I think a lot of people in the industry know bits about. So it's one that seems to work as an example. And you can see on the left-hand side a number of topics: platform height and offset, platform width, curvature of the adjacent track, crossfall, that's gradient across the platform, footstep position on the trains, gauge clearance, lighting. And yes, it would be lovely to have one standard that applied to all of these things. Actually, it's just not workable. So they are in a lot of different places. So some of the requirements are in the infrastructure, NTSN. Some of the requirements are in the persons of reduced mobility, NTSN. In a number of cases, GB had in the TSI a specific case, and that refers out to our own Railway Group standards. That position still exists. So for gauge clearance, for example, that refers out to the gauging suite of documents that we have. And then there's an open point in the PRM NTSN on platform width. So again, that's covered by a Railway Group standard. There is guidance available in those two documents I've listed at the bottom. Once we've finished reviewing the NTSNs, both of those documents will also be reviewed and updated. But just because one of them says TSI doesn't mean it's not useful. There is still useful information in there. So, a question I often get asked: gauge clearance, stepping distances, what are the standards, what should we do? So, for an infrastructure project, whether that's work to the track or work to the platform, the requirement is the platform position. The stepping distance is, of course, interesting, but that is not the requirement. The requirement for an infrastructure project is the relative position of the platform and the track. The step position relative to the standard platform, so, is actually a requirement for the rolling stock. and then managing the resulting stepping distance at each actual platform to each actual train is a joint responsibility of the relevant train operators, maybe more than one at a given platform, and the station operator. Of course, over time, new rolling stock may be introduced, so the stepping may change, but the requirement for the infrastructure is that the relative position between the track and the platform. And yes, this is a slightly cynical way of putting it, but in terms of clearance, positive clearance is obviously a requirement. Normal clearances are not a requirement. If the clearance is less than what's defined as normal, and that varies in platform areas from other areas, then there may be additional inspection requirements, but it isn't a standard requirement to have normal clearances. And in some areas, you may wish to consider improved stepping by having less than normal clearances, as long as the maintainer accepts the implications. And always consider track fixity and consider what vehicles are actually intending to run. We did have, until a few years ago, I think it's mostly stopped now, people still gauging platforms for North of London Eurostars, which really isn't very sensible. And if you think there's something in there that doesn't sound right, ask the questions. An RSSB is always happy to provide advice. So let's have an example. Increase in passenger numbers, increase in train length. So we want to increase the platform length. We've got new rolling stock coming in. The train's a bit longer. We need to make the platform a bit longer to fit the train. But it's an existing station. There's no spare land. It's in a cutting. It's got roads, bridges, houses, etc. all around it. So it's not a greenfield site. It's a challenge. Okay, what standards do we need? Well, this is a mainline railway, but it's not part of the infrastructure NTSN. So we're using railway group standards. So what do we need to worry about? Platform height and project for that. Platform width, that's going to be a challenge. There simply isn't enough space. We can't build to the standard width. So we're going to have to look at a deviation for that. And platform curvature, the track's on a curve, so the platform is inevitably going to on a curve. We need to think about that one. Crossfall we can do. Buffer stops is not a terminal platform, so there's no buffer stop or overrun risk problem. And the other issues are all covered. But we've got those two things that are going to give us a challenge. So let's look at those in a bit more detail. Platform width. This is a platform extension. So assuming that it's not on the only way to the main exit, then there may be ways we can manage passenger numbers in that area to avoid crowding. But we need to think about emergency evacuation, modelling of passenger flows, look at the line speed, the number of stopping and non-stopping trains, avoid obstacles on narrow bits of platforms. I know people who've tried to build narrow platforms and then put a seat on it. Not a good move. What about staffing? Are we actually going to have to increase the number of people on the platform in order to manage the narrow area? What can we do with announcements? What can we do with signage? Hopefully, the wheelchair ramp doesn't have to come down in that bit of platform. If it does, that will have to be thought about. So there's a lot of things to think about for platform width. For platform curvature, there's a slightly different set of issues to consider. And some operators have done this using modern technology, some have done it using old technology. But what are the stepping distances for the different door positions? And if the curvature varies along the platform, is it possible to optimise the stop boards? Do short trains need to stop at the curviest bit of a platform? Can they use the less curvy bit? And you can see from my very simplistic diagram there that depending on whether the platform is on the inside or the outside of the curve, you get smaller or greater stepping distances at the 1/3, 2/3 doors by the bogies at the top, or the end doors at the ends of the vehicles at the bottom. And we now have some trains on the network with middle doors. visibility along the train for staff, for the train dispatch. On the inside of a curve, that's not a problem, usually. There's probably somewhere that the train dispatcher can stand and see all the doors on even an 8-car train or a 10-car train. On the outside of the curve, that may simply not be possible. In which case, does that mean more staff? Does the station staffing actually have to increase in order to be able to manage a longer train? All questions that need to be thought about, all questions that need to be consulted on with the affected parties. And what about the works themselves? The hazards, risks during temporary works are just as real as the ones when the job's finished. And temporary hoardings may reduce the available platform width during the work. They may interfere with the view along the platform for train dispatch, also for passengers knowing where they're going. So there's a range of issues there to think about and how to manage that risk. And if the platform width during the works is less than the standard, that still needs a deviation, even though it's temporary. So that's what we wanted to go through. I hope we've done that. I can't see the chat at the moment, so I will stop sharing, and then it's over to everybody for questions.
Oh.
Are you managing questions, Joss, or how do we want to do this?
Looks like we've lost Joss.
Okay, well, in that case, let's have a look at the questions. If during the project design development an RSSB standard is updated and the project has been working to a previous revision, do you need to apply for a deviation against the old revision if the new revision changed the specific requirement? There is usually at least a 3-month lag between the standard being published and it coming into force. And some standards actually have backwards looking things saying, or you can comply to an earlier one. If you are in that position, the best thing is to ask RSSB, well, ask your whoever's imposed the standard on you, but also ask RSSB, and they can give you a particular view. There is no automatic requirement to go to the new version if your contract says the old version. Very few standards are retrospective. So in most cases, it will be okay to carry on, but you might need to get approval from the appropriate people. I think that's another one for me. What if a positive clearance results in the rail system, electrical standing surface to electrification? Yes, so the standard takes into account, because the standard platform height is measured from the track and the electrification is also measured from the track. They are measured from the same datum. So if both are to standard, there shouldn't be an issue. If there is an issue, we're not aware of any areas where complying with standards in one area provides a conflict with a standard in another area. But if you find one, please tell us, and we will discuss it and work out how best to manage that. Welcome back, Joss. We thought we'd lost you.
Apologies, technology. I don't think the mic was working, but thank you very much. But please continue with the questions in the chat. I'm not sure how far through the list you got.
I think this is one for Steph. Can you see that one, Steph?
Which
From
one's
unknown
that?
user, whoever unknown user is.
Oh, is that about the legislation for net zero?
Emissions. Yeah, have
Yeah.
you answered that one already?
No, I've not answered it, and I I don't know the answer to that, actually. You know, if there is going to be anything in terms of meeting net zero emissions, you know, it could possibly be something that's put into NTSNs, perhaps. But I've not got any information on that at the moment.
There's a lot of work going on in RSSB with sustainability and with research on how to assess some of these things. And there's also new standards on the rolling stock side on managing multi-mode vehicles, which are likely to be at least part of the transition in the next 10-20 years. So vehicles that can operate in, we call them multi-mode now rather than bi-mode or tri-mode, because some of them have a whole load of different modes in which they can operate, and the transitions need managing. So there are no requirements in our standards that say you can't do things. There are some requirements, I think, about introducing new diesel engines and what emissions they need to meet and all that sort of thing, but that's a bit out of my comfort zone.
Okay, thank you. There's lots of questions in here with 180 people watching and many comments joined in. Let's have a look. The next one, I think, is from Stephen. Rolling stock that actually runs, can we therefore ignore what is published in the authorised in NESA if a particular vehicle doesn't run on a particular route?
You can't just ignore it, but I would recommend that you challenge it and say, this is the consequence of gauging for this. Do you understand, Mr. Project or Mr. Sponsor or Mrs. Sponsor, whoever it is you're referring back to, that this is the consequence of doing that? And is that what you want? So you have to have that dialogue. No, you can't ignore what's in the sectional appendix. That clearly wouldn't be, that's not a decision a project can take, which is why I cited the example of the North of London Eurostars, which don't even exist. So there is absolutely no way that anybody could be running them. But until a few years ago, people were still being asked to gauge for them because theoretically they had clearance, even though we know GB no longer owns the vehicles. So there's absolutely no way that they were a real concern.
Okay, there's quite a lot in here, so I'm going to rush through.
Do you want to jot about and pick out some
apologies if we don't get to some. We will finish it in 10 minutes time, so we've got another 10 minutes of questions. So if you want to put some more in, please do, but there's quite a lot here. Another question, Sankadev, why platform tracks should not be considered low track fixity? Isn't low track fixity more conservative option?
Yes, low track fixity assumes that the track may move around quite a lot. And therefore you end up with more clearance between the platform and the track because you have to allow for that movement. If you've got a solid brick-faced platform which goes down a metre below track level, then is the track going to move sideways? It's got nowhere to go. There's nowhere for the ballast to go. It can't realistically move towards the track, towards the platform. So Network Rail Gauging are currently doing a big exercise looking at what track fixity is appropriate in different types of platforms. If you've got something like East Midlands Parkway, which is just posts into the ground and the ballast is essentially free to move under the platform, then yes, low track fixity may be reasonable. But if you've got a historic platform with solid brick or whatever walls, I think low track fixity is, yes, it's a conservative assumption from the maintenance point of view, but it will increase the platform train stepping distances by potentially tens of millimetres for every one of hundreds of thousands of people. And that doesn't sound like the right risk balance.
Okay. Thank you very much. There are lots and lots of questions in this chat. I'm very grateful for them, and we're going to run out of time. So as the chair, I'm just going to take my privilege and skip through to some that I know are some high-level questions. So here's a good question from Christopher. Is a deviation from an NTSN initiated by the proposer in the same way as a deviation to RGS?
It's initiated by, yes. Well, deviation is called an exemption from an NTSN, and the application would go to the Department for Transport. So yeah, the proposer of the change or the project would actually apply to DFT for an exemption.
Okay. Go back one here. This is with regard to RGS, and I forget the full reference, 7020. But how do the standard requirements in 7020 align when a project is deemed as non-interoperable?
GIRT 7020, to give it its full title, is a railway group standard which is called up to fill an open point in the NTSN, but is also a railway group standard. So for the mainline railway, that is the requirement, regardless of whether it's interoperable or not. It isn't a requirement, for example, for London Underground or Glasgow Subway or some other systems which have their own standards. But it doesn't make any difference whether it's interoperable or not. The platform position on the mainline railway is given in 7020 and the link out to the gauging standards for the offset.
Okay, there's another one here. Thank you. This one's a little bit of a challenge, back to RSSB, I feel. Another one from Sankadev. There is a concerted effort among designers to satisfy both NR standards and RGS, even if RGS updating frequency cannot keep up with NR standards evolution. How should we go about it? Can we be critical about RGS and raise standard challenge to RGS?
Do you want me to do that one, Steph?
Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah, anybody can make a change request or a request for help to a railway group standard at any time. And if Network Rail wish to update something and they feel that it's an improved way of dealing with something which is in a railway group standard, please flag that up. The railway group standards are mandatory on duty holders. Network Rail don't have the right to change that. The rail industry standards are mandated by the duty holders under their safety management system. So Network Rail can look at alternative ways to managing risk if it's in the railway industry standard. If it's in a railway group standard, then they have to do it unless it's changed. So if a Network Rail standard appears not to be consistent with a railway group standard, then regrettably it's the Network Rail standard that's out of sync. Doesn't mean it's not better, but the railway group standard needs to go through a process. And that will go through the process that Steph described of industry consultation, because what might appear to be a simple change for Network Rail or any other party, I'm not picking on Network Rail, for one party, might actually have unintended consequences for other parties, which is why we go through the full industry process to make sure that there isn't an unintended consequence somewhere that's going to cause a real problem.
Okay, thank you very much. This one might be for Steph. This is a follow-on from a previous question about the is a deviation from NTSN initiated by the proposer. Another question off the back of that one, and maybe you've already answered this, but it's another question on the question. Various RGS and RISs are deemed NNTSs, National Notified Technical Rules, which are approved deviations from the NTSNs and TSIs. Not sure if it's still the case after the EU withdrawal completion. Has the EU withdrawal completion made any difference to the way we operate? I think that's probably for Steph.
I can give that one a go while Steph's getting his brain around it, and he'll tell me if I've missed something.
Yeah.
The decision that has been taken with the NTSNs is to keep the text that describes GB's specific cases as specific cases, rather than to change the main text of the document. and that is largely to make it easily understandable by suppliers who will probably be supplying into the rest of the European railways as well as to us. So if the documents are relatively straightforward to switch between, it's much easier for the suppliers. If we make it hard for the suppliers, we pay for that, and that is not in anybody's interests. It's not in the interests of our supply chain exporting, and it's not in the interest of us buying stuff in. So essentially, the NTSNs still support specific cases or open points in the NNTRs still support specific cases or open points in the NTSNs, just as they did in the TSIs. And the subtlety in there is that if you are using a national technical rule, so a railway group standard, RSSB can give you a deviation to that, because you're not departing from the NTSN. If it was written into the core text of the NTSN, then as Steph said a bit ago, it would have to go to the DFT to agree.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a bit subtle, but I hope that makes a change. Makes sense.
Yeah, and
Steph should have the opportunity because you're switching the mic on.
yeah, so I was just going to say, RISs are not NTRs, as it said in the question. And just to clarify, there was another question about where RGS is sat in the triangle. So RGS, so wherever it says NTRs, that means that's RGSs as well.
Okay, I'm going to wrap this up because we're approaching the hour mark, which is when we said we would finish. Currently, we have over 200 participants online. I'm just going to say thank you very much, Steph and Bridget. That was a fantastic presentation by RSSB for the PWI Lunch and Learn session. I would just ask everyone to switch on their microphones and say thank you with a round of applause, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. I shall finish it there.
And
We'll finish the recording.
there. Oh, and just to let you know that the conversation can carry on if anyone wants to put any comments on there or tell us what they thought about it as well. So do have a look over on LinkedIn.
And of course, share the video when it becomes available online at the PWI.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much.
Right. Bye.